what I'm going to talk today. First, I'm going to talk about what open science is, mentioning the key features of open science, and going into three of the key critical components of open science that are open access publication, open scholarly communication, and open research data. So for open research data, I'm going to focus on 5 facts about it, and then mention some of the key indicators of open research data. These key indicators are the number or availability of data repositories that a country has, the policies of funding agencies, and also the researchers' attitude towards open research data. Later, I'm going to talk about what's going on with open research data in Switzerland, and finally, I'm going to mention the relationship between SIP and ORD, and I'm going to close with why ORD is important. So let's start. So, what is open science? It's the movement that advocates for openness and transparency of the scientific research. It involves sharing scientific knowledge, data, tools without restrictions and fees, to promote collaboration and to accelerate progress in science. So we see here an article published in Nature in 2013. This article says, keeping your research data freely available is crucial for open science. We all know that, right? But your funding could be telling it, and why is that? So SNCF, in the past, for projects that were funded between 2017 and 2022, was requesting the researchers to send a data management plan, and at the end of the project, publish it. So only in Switzerland, 34% of the publications were open access on average. So are we going to get to this target in the future? I don't know. Hopefully, yes. Researchers had to deal with different routes to publish the articles, and depending on the scientific community or the discipline, researchers choose different routes or has a preference. For example, in computational biology or computational sciences or physics, the diamond open access route is the more common one, while I could say that for biology, gold open access or green are the most common ones. And in robotics, what I saw was that the hybrid open access route was the most chosen one, so it was very difficult to switch to a different one, right? Okay, the next key topic is scholarly communication. So having open scholarly communication drives how science moves, and it works bottom up because it's from the community, not from the policy. And we can see that communication in social media, like on Twitter or Mastodon today, can drive conversations. Also, researchers publish and comment articles on ResearchGate, academia.edu, or even in blogs. There is a lot of comments on papers on the tool PubPeer, and recently I saw, this is funny because I saw on Twitter someone saying, oh, go to PubPeer to see this article and comment on it because it's mentioning 2 drugs to deal with COVID, and they were requesting the authors to retract the paper. So there was a big link there. And finally, the discussion of preprints, it's very common in many disciplines, like using archive or bioarchive or chem archive. Each discipline has its own archive to deal with discussion of preprints. Okay, so now we're on open research data, and it's the data that can be freely used, reused, and redistributed by anyone, only subject that they credit the author of the data and they use the same license. Basically, to do open research data, we need to follow the FAIR data principles, And for the ones that don't know it, it's that the data needs to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and I'm sure everybody knows it here. And from the NCCR experience that I have, having a good research data management strategy can help all the researchers to deal better with open research data. And so I'm going to mention later 3 main indicators of open research data. These are, as I said before, the availability of data repositories, the policies of the research founders, and the researchers' attitude towards open research data. So now I'm going to talk about 5 facts about open research data. So first, open research data promotes transparency and scientific integrity. So basically, an example of promoting transparency and scientific integrity, we can have climate change researchers publishing data sets on temperature and precipitation, and later other researchers take this data and confirm that the trends that the original researchers found are the same. So this is a way of being transparent. Open research data also enables interdisciplinary collaboration and innovation, and basically a good example of this is when we have a biological data set that is later taken by researchers of a different discipline like medicine or agriculture, and basically they can gain knowledge from this data in a different way. Open research data also enhances reproducibility and research validation. In medical data, it's very important to be able to reproduce the results to confirm that they were correct and to validate them. Open research data also promotes inclusivity and global collaboration. And this case, for me, is very important because when I did my PhD in Argentina, so let's talk about low-income countries. It's difficult sometimes to access good quality data. So without having good quality data on environmental characteristics and genetic data on species distribution, I wouldn't have been able to develop my PhD. So this is key for me. And finally, the open research data drives societal impact and innovation. Policymakers can take data also, not only the researchers, and then they can define public health policies. Also, entrepreneurs can take the data and develop new tools that can help on health. So it's very wide, the use of open research data, and why everyone can use it. And going now to the availability of data repositories, the indicators of ORD. So we know that there are many data repositories. So this is just an overview, but when we select a data repository, we have to keep in mind that it is our founding agency accepts it. So keep in mind that. We have a lot of types like discipline data repositories. We have generic ones, international, national, and then we have institutional repositories. So the availability of data repositories is huge. So we need to be intelligent on the way we chose our repository. I remember once we published an article at the University of Lausanne in biology. It was very common that the journal gives you a link directly to Dryad to upload your data. So we didn't have a choice, but Dryad, it's accepted by our funding agency, so it's great. And we can have a look here of the number of data repositories by country. We can compare Switzerland, that is in the bottom, with our neighbor countries or the countries in North America. We see that Switzerland is not doing bad. It has 84 data repositories compared to the US that has more than 1,000. But what is important here is to consider what's happening in relation to the number of inhabitants. So Switzerland has much more data repositories in relation to the number of inhabitants compared to our neighbor countries, and even more than the US. So Switzerland is doing really well in that sense. About the policies of the research founders, which is another indicator. So here I'm just a quick overview that Switzerland reported on Sherpa Juliet for founding agencies, and for SNSF, it mentions that it requires open access archiving, it requires open access publishing, and it requires data archiving. And it's very important to have good policies from our funding agencies to promote this. So in United Kingdom, many funding agencies have no policy, so it doesn't help for open research data. And finally, the researchers' attitude towards data sharing. So this is a study, a survey that was done by the widely publisher editorial company, and it's quite old, it's from 2013. And they surveyed 2,000 researchers on different disciplines, and they found out that half of these researchers were only sharing data openly. So it's quite low, the number. But okay, this was 10 years ago, maybe things change. And why they were motivated to share their data, there were many reasons, starting from because it's a standard practice in their community, because it has impact and visibility on their research, because it was a public benefit, the journal requirement, it has transparency and better for reuse, because someone personally asked them to share the data, and less because it was a founder requirement or institutional requirement. And it's funny because 3 years later, in 2016, Elsevier editorial did a similar research, and only 35% of the people said that they didn't share their data on their last project. So it's starting to change slowly. Okay, so what's going on with ORD in Switzerland? We have this national strategy and action plan that was requested by the CERI to the Swiss universities. This strategy and action plan aims to promote open and fair research data practices and has different goals like providing training and support for researchers, promoting the use of standardized metadata and data formats, and also establishing sustainable and interoperable data infrastructure. So this national strategy and action plan contains also a very big funding scheme that maybe a lot of researchers already know or are part of it. Sometimes are the institutions that are taking advantage of this funding scheme. But yeah, so things are moving in Switzerland, right? But we still have some challenges that we need to overcome. So what I think are the biggest challenges in Switzerland are first the legal and ethical concerns. So the researchers have to navigate the very broad legal landscape, right? We have federal laws, we have cantonal laws, we also have to get a consent from our patients if we are dealing with sensitive data, we have to deal with the data protection laws. So it is a big challenge. So we really need sometimes good support from the legal departments of our institutions. Data management and curation, so if we don't know how to manage our data and have a good strategy on data management and curation, we cannot do good open research data practices. Technical infrastructure is another challenge, and sometimes for the researchers and institutions, it's very expensive to have an infrastructure to store data, and they need to spend a lot of money on it. And sometimes it's difficult to find the right storage infrastructure for our needs. Specifically, I remember at NCCR Robotics, it was very difficult to find a solution of data storage of videos of patients doing surveys. And I still, at the end of NCCR Robotics, we couldn't find a solution for that. It was expensive.
the researchers need to share the data with not only Swiss colleagues, but also colleagues outside Switzerland. So how they were supposed to share all these huge videos. It's unknown for me yet. So also there is another challenge is the cultural change, and sometimes researchers are not keen to share the data because they are afraid that they can copy their research or misinterpret the data. Also, there is an age, I would say the age of the researchers help a lot. So younger researchers are more keen to share data or to learn how to do it, while older researchers are more hesitant. And finally, the sustainability of the practices is a challenge because we don't know if this action plan from Swiss University is going to be forever. We don't know for how long we are going to have funding to support our research practices, open research data practices. So it's another challenge here in Switzerland. So now a little bit of what SIB is, and basically the relationship of SIB with ORD. So basically the Swiss Institute of Bioinformatics is very actively involved in promoting ORD practices. And how is it doing it? Basically by providing a stable and sustainable data infrastructure. So SIB, it's a huge data infrastructure and huge data resource, data resource infrastructure. So in that sense, we're promoting it a lot. Also, the SIB provides training and education for researchers on bioinformatics. For example, we are giving training on data science, statistics, and fair data management. So guiding our researchers to do better practices on open research data. And finally, we have a big collaboration with national and international initiatives. Nationally, we're currently within this funding scheme of Swiss universities, of the ORD projects, and we're going to be developing a CAS on data stewardship. We're going to be leading the module of the life science track of this data stewardship CAS. And this project is led by the University of Lausanne and many other institutions in Switzerland. I don't recall the others. I think it's the University of Zurich, Force Institute as well is part of it for the social sciences. And internationally, we are collaborating with the Elixir platform, which is a European platform of bioinformatics, very big also in Europe. And how the SIB is creating value from data. So the researchers, the individual researchers just develop the data, create the data, but then they deposit it into the SIB, in the biodata resources. So the SIB, I put a square there, it's in charge of digesting this data and putting it into knowledge models and into data repositories and databases. Some of these data are open, data repositories. There is also one example of a restricted access database that it's on the Vital IT group of SIB, and it contains data on diabetes patients. And then later, this data comes out from the SIB and can be taken, reused, mined, and integrated by other researchers, by the industry, by clinicians, public health, government, and the general public. A good example here of our resources is the UniProt resource, which contains protein sequences. So UniProt is one of the biggest data resource of proteins in the world. It contains more than 1 million protein sequences, and it's used all over the world by people every month. It's the mostly used. I think it's over 1 million people use it over every month. And you can find more examples of our resources in the EXPASY data resource portal that belongs to the SIB. And here I just added the data lifecycle that Michael was going to talk later, but yeah, we're not going to see it. But basically, yeah, people publishes the data and can go to our data resource portal, and then it can be reused by anyone. And finally, yeah, I cannot come here without advertising our courses, of course, because my boss would kill me if I don't do this. Sorry, guys. So, yeah, some of our courses related to open research data are version control with Git, introduction to FAIR research data management and data management plan, submitting and finding, downloading raw sequencing data with ENA. We also have many statistic course, first steps in R, first steps in Python, and advanced statistic course for young researchers. And to close, so why is ORD important? Globally, we said that it promotes collaboration and also global equity. So researchers from all over the world can access data, doesn't matter where they are from, and they can provide new knowledge. In Europe, it's important because Horizon Europe program depends on open research data, so they are asking researchers to follow open research data practices. It also promotes cross-border collaboration. A good example is this platform of COVID-19 Europe, where researchers from Europe can collaborate, providing data at a European level. So it's a quite good platform. And in Switzerland, to close, so SNSF is asking us to follow ORD practices. It is also part of the Swiss, let's say, culture of excellence in research and in collaboration. We are always innovative. So it's a good part of the Switzerland culture. And it's also part of our national strategy. And to close, it promotes collaboration, transparency, innovation in scientific research, leading to better outcomes for society as a whole. And that's it. So thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to take some questions.
So at the beginning of the talk, you were talking about the data management plan and the change of policy from the SNF in 2023. And I would like to hear, like, don't you think this is actually a step backward? Can you comment?
Yeah, so I learned this like last week. It's quite new. I thought that they were going back. Originally in 2017, they said, okay, everyone that applies for a project needs to send a data management plan. And at the end of the projects that are accepted have to publish the plan. 2022 or 21, they say, no, you don't have to publish the data management plan. So one step forward. And now only the projects that are approved have to send the data management plan. So I don't know if it is because they lack of resources to evaluate the data management plans, or is it because they don't think it's important to evaluate the project? But yeah, once your project is approved, you need to have it. So at the end of the data lifecycle, you need to do it.
Since we have someone from the SNF here,
yes,
we will just ask her. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks very much for this really nice presentation. So for, about this change in policy, so of course it doesn't mean that we don't ask for it, that doesn't mean that people shouldn't do it. It's not because we then don't control it for that it's that it can be part now of what people do from the start, but we're also sort of changing focus on also looking at whether data sets have been deposited, and that's also, as you said, also a lot of resources for us. The data management plan of non-accepted projects were not always very well done, and so yeah, we prefer to have now this sort of more active feedback just on accepted projects and changing the focus on whether then there are data sets deposited when we see a publication.
That's right, yeah. So you're really counting how many data sets are deposited at the end of the project.
So for NCCRs, we already do it actually more closely than perhaps the other SNSF for other SNSF projects. But yeah, we're definitely moving in that direction. So asking researchers whether they have deposited their data, and then for the control of the DMP, it also allows then the person who looks at it to give really more valuable feedback, perhaps, which we hope we were already doing for the NCCRs, but was less consistent in project funding to sort of raise the bar of these submitted DMPs once a project is accepted. And then the other thing, which for NCCRs it was already different because the research data management strategy was basically asked after the projects were approved, but we've seen that also the quality of these DMPs were much, much better because you can think of it, there are different ways of seeing it, but basically once a project has started, people perhaps know better where they're going with the data. At the stage of the proposal, so it's already, of course, it's great to think of the data lifecycle, and that was the idea, but perhaps in practice, it may be easier for researchers to imagine where they want to deposit their data once the project has started. Within that first year, let's say, of the project.
Yeah, we had to consider that the DMP is a live plan, right? It
Exactly,
changes, it gets updated with the progress of the project. It's not static, so.
No, and so of course you can update it at any time and the final version, but we had very good experience with NCCRs where the DMPs were submitted after projects have actually been approved. So it was a good model for the other SNSF project funding schemes.
Any other question?
Thanks a lot for the nice presentation. I would have a question regarding the data stewardship that you were talking about. So as a PhD student, of course, I'm like in the trenches of implementing all of this ORD that you have been talking about. How have you perceived the adoption so far with the groups you've been working? So for example, with the videos you were presenting, how much have these been used, and have you seen a change in the research groups?
So I can speak from my experience at NCCR in that sense. So we implemented the data management strategy right at the end of the phase of the NCCR. So we started doing it in 2020 and the NCCR ended last year, right? So it was difficult to see a huge change, right? It was only 2 years of actions for researchers after the implementation of the strategy, but from the point of view of open access publications, we saw a big change, and from the point of view of open research data, we saw that researchers were starting to use data repositories after the implementation of the strategy. We really saw a change, and how we had a community in Zenodo for our NCCR, and we saw how the number of data sets published there in our community increased after we implemented the strategy. So the researchers are taking the recommendations, but it takes time. Yes.
Do you think the this CAS course you were mentioning will...
So the CAS is going to be a course that it hasn't started yet. It's going to be developed this year, and SIB is going to be in charge of the life science track, right? I don't know how they are going to propose the different modules, or if you could just take the life science track or the social track. I don't know how it's going to be done. But for sure, we are going to use, at SIP, we are going to use our experience with biomedical and biological data, and yeah, to propose training in that sense. But from what we see in our courses, at least the number of participants we have, for example, this course that I think it's here, the FAIR, yeah, the second one, I'm coordinating this course. So it's a course that there is a lot of interest in Switzerland for this course. We do it 3 times a year. And we even have people coming from Europe, from different countries of Europe to take this course, even though it's mostly recommended. It talks mostly about the Swiss policy, right? But still, we have people coming from Europe, so there is a big need, yeah, from young researchers to learn about data management.
Thanks.
I have a question a bit towards the SNF. We, as microscopists, we struggle a lot on how we could actually store our microscopy data after publishing it. So at the Biozentrum, for instance, we have an Omero, which is fine so far for all the data from the microscopes which goes in there. But then there should be something at the university, or even better in Switzerland, where all of the imaging data could go. Because even if you would accept to put it into Zenodo, which is not so great for imaging data because you lose all of the structure, you're limited to 20 gigs, right? I mean, you can negotiate for more, but like in the NCCR, we have terabytes of data. And if you have to provide the original data, the raw data, so this is a really big problem. And so far, I'm not aware of anything in Switzerland where we can put that. So now there is the IDR at the Eurobioimaging. And my question is, has the SNF any plans to, like recommend something, team up with something like we see, at EMBL and so on?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a great question, which obviously you see in biology, but also in other fields. So we, as a funder, apart from following the different developments, and I think this goes into the Swiss the national initiative. So for sure, this is these are the issues that they're trying to address. We can only offer grants. So you do have grants for ORD costs, so up to 10,000 for projects. So for the NCCR, there's actually not necessarily a limit, but because obviously it's many groups together. But apart from offering some funding, we can't promote a single a solution which is sort of for different research fields, or but we are aware of the issue.
Just I know that there is this data repository, OLOS. Maybe you can talk to them and ask them. Maybe it's not what you need. It is, yes. So, and yeah, if you don't have an institutional repository, it's very difficult to adapt to your needs. And not all universities have an institutional repository. So I understand your pain. Yeah.
So maybe I have another question, but following up on this actually, because you say that 50% of the researchers do not share data. And so do you have data, or like, do you know about like survey, or like why people are not sharing that data? Is that because, and actually it's, like, is it technical? Is it like financial, or is it because there's fear of competition? Because the financial part, I think, money cannot solve all, can solve some of it, and it's a little bit what Oliver was saying. So if it's more technical, I feel like we need a more global solution from not just Switzerland, but all over the world, because you also want to share your data with in other countries. So are you aware of any like study showing in which country, what are the challenges in different countries? I imagine, in some countries it's more financial, in some countries it's more technical. So.
Yeah, I'm not aware of what's happening in other countries, but yeah, for sure. First is having the right tools to do it, and knowing and having access to the tools to deposit our data. That's first. But I'm not sure how it's going on in other countries. The European Commission has its own data repository, so probably in EU projects, they are already dealing better than us. I don't know. I know that they are much more strict in the requirements. But yeah, it really depends. I think it really depends on the project. The researchers go adapting to the project as long as the founding agency requirements change. So for some projects, they deal better with the practices of open research data. For others, not, because they don't see the need. And also, yeah, having someone young in the team, a young postdoc or a young professor, always helps a lot.
Thank you. I'm not actually sure who the correct audience is for this, but it's probably here. I think as scientists typically think of these issues in terms of the unit of a publication, right? So you get funding, and maybe if you're lucky, a publication comes out of it. And then we think, okay, the data that went into that publication needs to be made available publicly. So I guess maybe from the funder's perspective, what about the data that we generated that did not go into the publication? This is not necessarily useless, but on the other hand, if we deposit it, it's not going to be annotated or interpreted in any useful way. It's probably just going to take up hard drive space. So is this an issue that people think about?
Yeah, so of course that's something that in an ideal world, all data then would be shared, but we have to start somewhere. So obviously it's the data underlying the publications. But this is why in the funding regulations, you see that it just refers to data. And of course, if you dig in deeper, then you see that it's just the data underlying publication, because of course, in some fields, they do share more data, and obviously that's to be encouraged. But already to have properly annotated data that went into the publication is already the first hurdle. So we have to go step by step. It's a moving field. We've seen earlier with the policies changing over time. Like we know it's also confusing this, but it's really a field that's moving, where perhaps we can already see with open access publishing that we're reaching a sort of understanding that there wasn't 15 years ago. So I think open research data is 10 years behind in terms of policy at SNF. So we're also hoping that, we'll see there more. And then to come back to your other question about what are the main hurdles? So what we hear the most, especially in biology, is that it's very time consuming to deposit the data. So, and then whether, so in some fields, it's already the norm to reuse the data that's been deposited, but in biology, some communities feel like it's not useful. It's rare that you would reuse someone else's work in this way. So already we have this sort of as that's the main hurdle we see, at least in biology. So then we continue, what you mentioned is yet way beyond that. So sharing all data when it's already hard to share the data underlying publications in some fields, also because of space issues.
Yeah, just to add a little note about it. So in the NCCR robotics data management strategy, we mentioned that some data cannot be shared because of a license or because it's sensitive or it's protected. So it was recommended to even share the metadata, right? You just deposit the metadata in a data repository. That was the recommendation in the strategy. And finally, at the end of the project, all the data generated by the project, even though it was not published, should be stored somewhere. And in that sense, EPFL does not have a data repository like research collection and ETH, but does have a data storage infrastructure that it's private and long-term. So at the end of the project, for example, if a professor retires or the project ended, you can store everything in that storage solution. So those are the recommendations, what you say, but then people does not have the time. Yeah.
Thanks. This is Giovanni Pizzi. I will also give a talk later. I just want to give a couple of comments on some of the points that were mentioned. I also agree that, at least in my field, I come from physics and material science. A lot of the barriers to actually share the data comes from the time it takes to actually make it accessible for others. Because in our case, we run thousands or hundreds of thousands of simulations, and you might have a lot of folders. But if you just dump it there, okay, you might comply with formal requirements, but how useful is this, millions of files in a folder? And I show maybe what we've been doing about this. The other part I wanted to comment is on the difficulty for people who generate a lot of data to actually put it. And actually, I will show one of the repositories was also mentioned by Valeria before, and the repositories that we have been developing for our field, which we did exactly because at the beginning we went to Zenodo like 7 years ago, and we asked, can we put more than 20, 50 gigabytes of data? And they said, essentially, the problem was, we don't have a way to ask you for money. So we would have had the money to pay, but there is no, especially because CERN is public, etc. There's not a financial way to pay them to get storage. And for them, of course, it will be complex to just allow some people to store a lot. But in the end, sometimes people say, maybe it's the cost of the data, but in reality, the current cost of storing data is essentially 60 francs per terabyte per year, which is not much. I mean, it depends on how much data you want to store, but essentially if you think one postdoc for 1 year is 100,000, and this means you can store 100 terabytes for 10 years, which is more or less the requirement with the same amount of money. And when we maintain a repository, now we need at least one person to maintain it full time. So the cost is really a tiny fraction of this. But again, also for us, we are not part of an NCCR. We don't have a way to get money, and so it's complicated. It's very good actually. SNSF puts the money for that. Sometimes it's even hard to find a place to give the money. So it's complicated, and also what guarantee you get. And if it's commercial, you can pay, but the difficulty is also not, I want to put it today, but I would like to have a guarantee that this data is there for some time, 10 years, and very difficult, even for, we're collaborating with the Swiss Supercomputer Center in Lugano. Even for them, we have some kind of guarantees, and now they develop a long-term storage service where you can put the data, you get handles, etc. But even for them, the visibility they have, the director has even on how long he's going to be there and can commit to get money beforehand. You pay today, put the data, but they have to promise that in 10 years they're still keeping it. Essentially, nobody can sign, not even the director of CSCS. So it's also a lot of this kind of more practical financial aspects sometimes.
Yeah. What you mentioned is the researchers often worry about the sustainability of the data repository. Before depositing the data, they wonder how sustainable is this repository, right? And for how, okay, I want it to be open forever and available forever and reusable forever, but how this forever works at the end, right?